Well, we're here, folks, and all this talk of major and minor modality, of course, connects to part of the theme tonight, which is music that has to do with Halloween. Of course, Mara and I were brainstorming and coming up with the program content for this series, and Mara pointed out, she said, well, you know, the October 30th program happens to be right before Halloween, so is there something in the symphonic repertoire that would be appropriate for this date? And I said, immediately, yes. And we're looking at it. Does he look like the most stable person in the world? Does he look like a lucid kind of guy? Well, he was neither stable nor lucid. He was an emotional hurricane, and he was someone who polarized people in his own day. Certainly not someone I would claim to be on par with Beethoven or Brahms, and the other Bs that will bookend this program, but someone who certainly fits within the context of music that might be appropriate for Halloween. We'll see that especially at the end of the Symphonie Fantastique, which we'll be spending quite some time talking about this evening. So let me go back to last week's program when we had a great sort of, I think, foundational exposition where we discussed music in the Enlightenment period, and we talked about how the symphony was born in the age of reason, the age of an emerging middle class, the age of public concerts where people could go and listen to music simply for the pleasure of being entertained by pleasing sounds. That's something we can take for granted today, I think, because we've lived through the 20th century. We've heard Stravinsky, we've heard Schoenberg, we've heard Boulez, and not everything that we listen to is pleasant sounding, nor is it supposed to be easy listening, to use that expression that sometimes comes up. But it's very much part of the zeitgeist of the 1760s, 70s, and 80s, as we saw last week with Haydn and Mozart. In Mozart's day, there was a famous musicologist, English language musicologist. He was a British professor by the name of Charles Burney. And he was asked, Dr. Burney, what's the purpose of music? And he had a great answer. He said, the purpose of music is to delight the ears and to divert us from worldly woes. In other words, when you listen to something, it should be a pleasant sort of fluff music that distracts you from having to pay taxes, I guess, or the fact that you are indeed mortal and will one day perish from the earth. Burney's answer seems to us sort of boneheaded in a way because it's antithetical to the way people thought about music in the next generations. In the classical period, music was supposed to be pleasing and balanced and noble and simple and present you with melodies that you could hum, whistle, sing, and easily retain. Velcro melodies, as we used to call them in graduate school. Yeah, if it's a good one, it's a Velcro melody. If you're still humming it the next day, it's a Velcro melody. We're going to listen to a very famous Velcro melody at the end of the program when we look at the finale of Brahms' First Symphony, also known as Beethoven's 10th Symphony. So what is it about the 19th century? What is it about how music changed? What should we take away? And how does it fit with Dr. Burney's assessment from the 1770s? Well, we enter today a period known as the Age of Romanticism. And in the Romantic period, a few important things happen. The most important can be summed up in one word: Beethoven. Beethoven happened. He came on the scene in 1808. There was a concert at the Theater an der Wien, a theater in Vienna. It was probably no warmer than 55 degrees in the theater. It was December 22nd, 1808. It was about 4 hours of music. It included a choral fantasy, a piano concerto, and 2 new symphonies by Beethoven. So the audience in that freezing theater in 1808 really got their money's worth. I think it's fair to say they were there at the premiere of both the Fifth Symphony and the Sixth Symphony, both of which were premiered on the same evening, but in reverse order. Beethoven seems to have been aware of the fact that the Sixth Symphony would not be a suitable piece to end the evening, but rather the Fifth Symphony would be better suited for that purpose. And when the audience gets to the end of this program, they call for an encore. It tells us a lot. Now, today, many people don't have the patience to sit through a 4-hour concert, unless you like Wagner, in which case maybe you sit through a 5-hour performance. If it's Die Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, maybe it's more than 5 hours. Counting the intermissions, maybe it's closer to 6. But when Brunhilde rides her trusty steed Grena into the inferno of Valhalla, there's nothing more sublime. Or is there? Well, that's something we could debate. But back to Beethoven. We could say any number of important things about Beethoven, but I want to focus on one. And we're actually not going to have time tonight to listen to the Sixth Symphony, but I do want to mention it so that we can lay a foundation for what we're going to discuss today, which is a fundamental dichotomy in this century between two types of symphonies. If you were a composer back then, you had two choices. You could do what Mozart did and what Haydn did, and you could write what's called an absolute symphony or absolute music. By the way, if you want to impress your friends, you can tell them that in German, it's translated as Absolut Musik. They'll be very impressed by that. Musik spelled with a K, by the way, for you German grammar fanatics. So what that means is just what it sounds like. It's music for music's sake, as it's sometimes defined. But if you wanted to go in a different direction, and I would suggest that this direction was embraced with more alacrity by the majority of composers, you might write what Beethoven sort of plants the seeds for with his Sixth Symphony. And that's what we call a programmatic symphony or a program symphony. And that's not just music for music's sake. It's music, instrumental, but it's meant to tell a story or convey an image or series of images or tableaus. And that becomes a very enchanting idea to composers for two reasons. One, as we'll see, because Beethoven did it, and anything Beethoven did became a source of inspiration, fascination, and in some cases, worship for these composers. Berlioz, for example, he's got good hair, I'll say that. Berlioz worshipped Beethoven. I'll go a step further. Berlioz worshipped the ground that Beethoven walked on. So much so that he irritated people by constantly talking about how much he worshipped Beethoven. Robert Schumann famously referred to Berlioz as a blathering oaf because he wouldn't shut up about how great Beethoven was. And apparently Berlioz was the kind of guy who, like many composers, lived with those scores, studied it to the point that if you asked them to hum or whistle an entire symphony, they could sit there for 45 minutes and do it. And Berlioz apparently would go around to people at gatherings and he would say things like, "Isn't it wonderful what Beethoven does in measure 137 of the Eroica Symphony?" And people found this irritating. So his worship of Beethoven, I think it's fair to say, for many people went a little bit too far past the point of reason. But again, I ask you, does he look like a lucid guy to you? As we'll see today, he was not a lucid guy. And in fact, in some cases, we have examples where the scholarship seems to suggest that not only was he including the idea of drug-fueled dreams into his works, but in fact he was on drugs when he wrote his music. And the scholarship suggests that at least part of the Symphonie Fantastique was written while Berlioz was on opium. That's right, he was high. What was he taking? Opium. That was his preferred drug. He liked to get sleepy and write music. The thing about Berlioz and about that generation, Berlioz born in 1803, is that he's not unusual. So many of these composers grew up idolizing Beethoven. They worshipped him because he had done so many things that went beyond what the genres were thought to be capable of. Let me give you an example. The Ninth Symphony. The inclusion of voices, which Beethoven supposedly was asked, why did he include voices? And according to Schiller, who is not always reliable, shall we say, trustworthy, Schiller says, well, yes, Beethoven, we asked the maestro, why did you use voices in the Ninth Symphony? And Beethoven replied, I needed voices to say that which the instruments could not. So in other words, if we imagine that Schiller is telling the truth, and he might as well have, because that might as well have been something that Beethoven said, what Beethoven is doing is he's taking something that has reached its apogee, and he's going further. It reminds me of a sonata by Robert Schumann, the G minor piano sonata. In the last movement, Schumann wants it to be played very fast. So he writes in the instructions, instead of the conventional Italian allegro, allegro vivace, vivacissimo, whatever, he writes it in German. And he writes, so schnell wie möglich, as fast as possible. Then you get to the coda, and it says, noch schneller, even faster. Wait a second here. You got to be an astrophysicist to puzzle that one out. But it's this idea. Schumann's using language that's based in sort of Beethoven's accomplishments and the perception that Beethoven had reached whatever was capable in the harmonic language of the time, in the forms and genres of the period, and he went beyond it. And that's what these composers are interested in. They're interested in forging a path which is highly stylized by their own individualism, that is pushing the boundaries in terms of harmony and rhythm and instrumentation. And Berlioz certainly does that. Whatever else we could say both for and against him, I think it's fair to say, and anybody assessing his works would have to say, he was an ingenious orchestrator. And in fact, he would go on to write a treatise on orchestral arrangement and orchestration. So what is it about the Sixth Symphony by Beethoven that plants the seeds for Berlioz and many others like him? Well, for those who know the Sixth Symphony, you know that in many ways it's kind of the opposite of the Fifth Symphony. The Fifth Symphony is all thunder, right? Ending powerful and aggressive and urgent sounding. And it starts with that very famous, what they call Schicksalsmotiv, the fate motif, which is so iconic and so instantly recognizable and does convey a sense of urgency. The Sixth Symphony goes in the opposite direction. Well, what does that suggest? It has such a gentle, flowing character to it. And in fact, Beethoven calls this symphony the pastoral symphony. Yes, it does have this sort of springy quality to it, this outdoorsy quality, this bucolic, rustic quality to it. Beethoven breaks some rules here. A symphony, as we said last week, should have 4 movements. Mozart and Haydn follow that to a T. Beethoven gets to his Sixth Symphony and writes 5 movements. And for each of the movements, he writes a description for a short sentence or two. So the first one says, awakening to the pleasures of the outdoors while arriving in the countryside. Beethoven, like most romantics, and he kind of sows the seeds for them, they love nature. They love the outdoors. Remember, it's the early 19th century. It's the era of industrialization, of factories, the proliferation of factory-made goods, which, of course, involves huge migrations of populations from the suburbs moving into the cities. The cities become crowded. They're sooty. They're grimy. We've read Dickens, right? We know what the cities, we know what London was like in the early 19th century and throughout the 19th century. For the Romantics, nature was the ultimate escape. You got out of the city, you went out to the countryside. I think this is something most people can relate to today on some level, but the Romantics really loved it. Of all of their favorite eras of history that the Romantics sort of idolized and dreamed about and wrote about in flowery, very, very positive, favorable language, it was the medieval period that they loved the most. The medieval period, well, didn't people live to be, 35 years old, and weren't they all dying of the plague? The Romantics didn't care about that. What they cared about was that in the medieval period, you didn't have this overpopulation, this saturation of humanity in concentrated, filthy, grimy, sooty places. You didn't have smokestacks belching black smoke into the atmosphere. You had rivers and streams that you could dive into and swim around and float and enjoy nature in a kind of uncorrupted way. I don't think anybody wanted to go swimming in the Thames in 1808, right? So the Romantics were really all about nature, and Beethoven, in the Pastoral Symphony, writes a symphony where each of the 5 movements is meant to capture a different image associated with nature. And we get awakening in the fields after arriving in the countryside. We get, in the second movement, it says, Szene am Bach. Bach, hey, we know him. Who's that? Bach? No, Bach is a name in German, but it also means stream, or a brook, really is a better word. A brook, a little gurgling body of water flowing by gently. The third movement, we get the pilgrims. They're dancing their country jig, and Beethoven gives us a sort of just what it sounds like, a rustic jig. In the fourth movement, we get Gewittersturm, the lightning storm, really. Gewitter is lightning. Sometimes it's translated as thunderstorm, but thunder is Donner, so it's a little different. the lightning storm, and it's in F minor, and it's got percussion hits that suggest sudden strikes, just as we would imagine the music conjuring up those images. And then in the fifth and final movement, we get the Song of Thanksgiving. As if, Beethoven was a baptized Catholic, but he was not a practicing Catholic. It wasn't what you call an in-the-pews Catholic. And in many ways, it seems in this movement that Beethoven, like many of the Romantics, is almost worshiping Gaia, worshiping the earth in a way that they idealized nature. So Beethoven gives us an example of program music there in the Sixth Symphony, where if you go into the concert hall, the first thing you get when you walk in is a program. And the program has these little notes that the composer writes, so that when you're listening, you know what to listen for. In other words, if you listen to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony and you didn't have program notes, I think most of us would say, yeah, I can sort of, if you were asked what do you picture, nobody would say, well, I'm picturing a factory, and they're turning out garments and hats. No, you would hear something that's gentle and has this sort of rolling quality in the first movement, something that suggests imagery on the order of the bucolic, the rustic, the tranquil, the serene. And the Fifth Symphony doesn't do that, by the way. As we know, the Fifth Symphony is dire, urgent, doomed, whatever it is. So music here in the 19th century becomes more than just sounds. It's not just about pleasing the ear, as Dr. Burney suggested 30 years prior to Beethoven's big premiere of the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies in December 22nd, 1808. It's about much more than that. Now we get to Berlioz. Berlioz was born in 1803, so by the time he's 25 or so, Beethoven's dead. And he grew up the son of a physician, and of course, Dad wanted him to be a physician to follow in his footsteps. Berlioz went to medical school in Paris. Well, what do you think medical school in Paris was like 200 years ago? I think if we had to choose one adjective, maybe heinous is one that comes to mind. Now, the thing is, it's the 19th century. These composers, to some degree, were all egomaniacs, much more than any previous generation of composers. If you go back to the medieval period, 60% of the existing manuscripts in most codexes don't even have attributions because the composer didn't take credit. In the medieval period, it's not about you. It's about God. It's about the church. So you don't even write your name on the score. And most composers, about 60% did not. Well, they started taking credit in the Renaissance. By the time you get to the Romantic, these guys want everything that they do to be documented for posterity. They're thinking that way. So Berlioz writes extensively about just about everything he does. And one of those things is he writes about medical school and dissections. They didn't have refrigerators back then, by the way. So just disgusting, gruesome imagery. And he's writing about it as if he's discussing the lunch menu at his favorite restaurant, as glibly and as flowing language as if he's discussing what the weather was like in the last week. Strange to read. And you can read this stuff, by the way. It has been documented. There are not only biographies of Berlioz, but a lot of his writing is available with simple Google search. Well, he drops out of medical school and decides that he's going to go for it and pursue life as a composer. Unlike most of the people we study in the textbook, Berlioz was not a virtuoso performer. He was not a pianist or a violinist the same way that most of the people that we study were. He was not a virtuoso singer the way that many of our composers that we study were very facile singers. He played some flute, he played some guitar, but mostly he understood music theory on a very conceptual level, having studied it, without really being, a virtuoso performer. He decides he's going to make a name for himself in another way. And how does he do that? He writes a symphony in 1830 called the Symphonie Fantastique. Might be translated as something like fantastical symphony, something that, again, conjures up fantasy, the supernatural. And he didn't just come up with this idea in a vacuum. It's the 19th century. It's the Romantic period. So this piece was born out of a love affair. And it was, as you can guess, think it was a happy ending? Not really. No, we know that these romantics, they weren't so interested in happy endings. They loved tragedy. They loved They love to use romantic love as a theme, but it's never a straightforward love where they get married and everyone is happy at the end. It's always forbidden love, as in the story of Tristan und Isolde, which Wagner famously said premiered in 1865. Or maybe it's, as we'll see in this symphony, it's unrequited love. So boy loves girl, girl doesn't love boy back. Right? And that's kind of what happened. Berlioz went to the theater, and he saw a performance of Romeo and Juliet. Hey, well, there you have it. That's, another story of forbidden love written a few hundred years after Tristan and Isolde was written. And the actress there is a woman named Harriet Smithson, a famous Shakespearean actress of the age, doesn't speak any French, but she's in France doing English language performances of Shakespeare. Berlioz sees her and is smitten. So he does what any crazy Frenchman does and bombards her with letters and flowers and proposals of marriage. She doesn't know him and she doesn't read French. I'm not making this up, by the way. I know it sounds like something that you could make up. And he can't understand why she's not returning his overtures. And he's very depressed and dejected about it. So what does a romantic artist do? You turn it into music. And he writes the Symphonie Fantastique, which is essentially a symphony where you get 5 movements. I'm going to summarize the first 4, then we'll listen to the 5th. First movement, Berlioz tells us in the program notes. He gives us a little paragraph, short, few sentences. He says, the artist, clearly meant to be himself, sees the idealized vision of a woman, the apex of what he's looking for in a woman. Across, they lock eyes, and he is drawn to her irresistibly. He calls the first movement reverie, a dreamlike state. In other words, he's so thunderstruck by her appearance that he can hardly breathe. He can't think. Yes. So Berlioz comes up with the first movement, and he gives her a melody, almost like a Wagnerian leitmotif. And it's a melody that he himself calls the idée fixe, the fixed idea. And it looks like this. And we're frozen. Okay, now we'll just wait for that. He calls it the idée fixe, and it's very simple. If we can't find it, I'll bring it up. I can play it on the piano in a moment. Hopefully this will load up so you can see it. And this melody is meant to represent her. He's clearly smitten with her. So it's very clever, isn't it? As a composer, you use a melody so that every time the melody plays, the audience knows that she's sort of appearing in the imagery. The second movement is he just calls it a ball. And they're at a ball. There's dancing. It's a nice 3/8 triple meter dance. And of course, we get more of this idée fixe, now presented as a sort of waltz music. At the end of the second movement, it says in the program notes, he asks her to dance, she rejects him. Can't imagine why. Well, that's not nice. Berlioz was a bit of a nut job, as we'll see, not only in this piece, but afterwards. The third movement, it says that the artist, again, clearly meant to be himself, seeks solace out in the meadows and fields of nature. And he's hanging out with a couple of shepherds. So Berlioz is very clever here. How do you convey this imagery of somebody being out in nature, hanging out with a couple of shepherds? Well, you make the music sound very sparse, very sort of lonely sounding by having it very Spartanly orchestrated. Only a few instruments playing here. And the ones that do play tend to be reed instruments, oboe, English horn, bassoon. Why? Because he's hanging out with shepherds. What do shepherds play? They play reed pipe instruments, right? So he's using reed instruments to suggest this imagery of being out in nature, hanging out with a couple of lonely shepherds. And he gets very depressed. He meditates on his rejection, and in this moment of desperation, the artist drinks laudanum, opium. Now we get what Leonard Bernstein calls the first example of psychedelia in music. So long before you've got Pink Floyd, you've got Hector Berlioz. Again, very creative in a way. Whether he's on drugs at this point, the scholarship again suggests that. Maybe he was, but it doesn't diminish the achievement and the accomplishment of what he created. So the fourth movement, the penultimate movement, he calls the march to the scaffold. You see, he's drunk all this opium out in the fields, and now he's passed out, and now he's having a trip, I guess, or nightmare, let's call it, if we want to be more diplomatic. I'm going to go ahead and Alt F4 this just so we can bring it back. And I guess the computer doesn't like Berlioz. So in this movement, it's the march to the scaffold. So we get a lot of percussion, a lot of brass. The music is snarling, angry sounding, very assertive, very in your face. To be honest, very loud. I think that's an adjective that should be used here because it really is. And then we get percussion, big snare roll at the end of the movement, and what happens? Well, it's the march to the scaffold. He's now been executed in his dream or in his trip, whatever we want to call it. So he's been tripping. He's now dreamed that he's been executed. Well, his dream goes on. What happens after he's executed? He wakes up. Well, if he's been executed, where's he going to wake up? In hell. And he actually writes this in the program notes. The artist dreams that he wakes up in hell and sees his own funeral unfolding. And who's at the funeral? All of the denizens of the night, all of the creepy crawlies, the skeletons, something out of Michael Jackson's Thriller video, werewolves and whatever else, homunculi, imps and succubi, whatever you can imagine being associated with the depths of hell, Berlioz conjures it up here. And he does a few really clever things here. First of all, he wants to set the imagery. So how does he do this? He starts us off with what we call diminished seventh chords. Diminished seventh chords are very unstable chords that want to resolve somewhere, but he doesn't resolve them. He just rolls them up and down in the strings like so. You get these creepy melodies in the violins. It's very clever. Again, we've been exposed to so much music, and every time we watch a film or TV show, music is a big part, even if it's in the background, it's a big part of what we hear. But for 1830, this is completely novel. Nobody's done anything like this before. Trying to have music that conjures up the depths of hell, you've got to be creative. Again, this sound. So there's a lot that's happening in the very beginning. We're going to listen to it in a minute. Maybe I just Control-Alt-Delete. Uh-oh. Well, Berlioz really did it this time. Maybe we can just restart this, and I'll show you a few more things. In fact, Amara, if you want to do this, and I'll demonstrate a couple more things on the piano. Dankeschön. Or should I say, merci beaucoup. About 3 minutes in, or less than that, Berlioz is going to present us with a familiar melody. Remember we talked about the Idee fixe, and I'll play it for you. Sounds like this. It's chromatic and winding and filled with these falling intervals. Do you hear that? Traditionally, when we listen to music, we say that that kind of falling interval gesture is often associated with longing, desire, right? And then he repeats it. When it comes back, and it comes back in every movement of the Symphonie Fantastique, when we hear it in the last movement, remember, it's supposed to represent, remember Harriet Smithson, that Irish actress that he was obsessed with, and for some inexplicable reason, she never returned any of his letters, never wrote him back. She would eventually marry him, by the way. It was not a happy marriage, folks. They hated each other. And it was a really ugly situation that they got into. But at this point, she doesn't even know who he is other than this crazy French guy who keeps sending her letters. we're going to hear that melody. It's going to come back in the last movement. We're going to hear it one more time. And when we hear it, it's played not in the violins as we've been hearing it, not in the French horns where it might sound noble and majestic, the way that brass instruments have that regal quality. Berlioz puts it in the piccolo clarinet. Piccolo clarinet? What on earth? Why does he do that? The answer, I think, is because, remember, it represents Harriet. And remember in the first movements, she was the ideal woman, beautiful to behold, enchanting, dreamlike in her ravishing qualities. Now he's in hell, and he's witnessing his own funerals. And everybody in hell, all of these demonic creatures are attending his funeral. And who's leading the funeral procession? It's good old Harriet. But she's not the beautiful, idealized woman of the first movement. She's now a hideous crone. She's a witch. Again, I wish he was still on screen. We would love to see him right now, wouldn't we? We can conjure him up in the mind's eye. So Berlioz comes up with this theme, and he's going to bring it back. But now is it going to sound beautiful? Is it going to have this quality? Not going to sound like that at all. He has to maintain the basic structure of the melody so that it's recognizable. But by putting it in the piccolo clarinet, he's going to make it sound, for lack of a better word, squeaky. It's not going to sound pleasant anymore. It's going to sound terrifying. And he puts it in this sort of 6/8 time signature where it's bouncing da-deem, 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 da-dum, da-deem, 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 da-dum in a high range while percussion is going and strings are playing something else. And it's going to sound really wacky. When that finishes, we're going to get another brilliant programmatic touch. Remember, he wants it to sound like a funeral. How do you do that in Catholic Paris? Well, you do that by using a melody which is associated with funereal rites in the Catholic liturgy. And he does this by using a melody that sounds like this. Then double time. Well, some of you may recognize this melody as the Dies Irae, the days of wrath. Thank you, Amara. The days of wrath. And it had been associated for about 800 years at that point with burial, with funerals. And it goes back to the days of Gregorian chant in the Middle Ages. Now, Berlioz gives a peculiar name to this movement. He calls it the dream of the witch's Sabbath. And he gets this idea probably from a painting by Francesco Goya from 1798, I want to say. Dream of the, let's just do Witch's Sabbath, Goya. And here's the painting that he had in mind. Oh, don't do this again. Or as they say in Canada, Mara, don't do it again. All right. That's not exactly something you'd put on a child's bedroom wall. This is up there with Edvard Munch's The Scream, but probably even more disturbing. Here we have a representation of the devil going back to the medieval pagan god Baphomet, who is traditionally depicted as a goat, an anthropomorphized goat with a laurel wreath. And then we have all of these lovely maternal figures here. You see them, aren't they nice? And they're offering up a little something to Baphomet, to the devil. They are sacrificing their children. You can see we're out in nature in the middle of nowhere. We've got some really disturbing imagery. Yeah. The bats are flying in the sky. The moon is out. So Berlioz, one can almost imagine him taking opium and looking at this painting and saying, I've got it. Let's go ahead and listen to the Symphonie Fantastique. And we'll listen to probably half of the finale. And we'll listen to a version by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra with the French conductor Deneve at the podium. So this is the Symphony Fantastique. And there we have it. So we'll go to about 50 minutes in is when this music starts. Again, think about it this way. Imagine this as an audience member in 1830. So you've never heard any Hollywood scores. You've never seen a television show that had music playing a vital role in conveying the drama. You're hearing something completely novel. And here's the fifth movement. You hear that creepy chromaticism. Oh, yeah. Function. Now, wait for your melody. You're going to hear the idée fixe shortly. Now the percussion is going to pick up, and the idée fixe will be heard shortly. And there it is. There's the Dies Irae. tells it here. This is a totally different kind of symphony. I think if you're coming out of the age of Beethoven and you get this kind of music, clearly it's indebted to Beethoven. The idea of writing something based on a story or an image that you're trying to convey or evoke, Berlioz is very effective. And he does this here through a number of different techniques we discussed. The introduction of the Dies Irae theme, one has to imagine that many members of his audience would have been familiar with the theme. And they would have said, ooh, you hear it, immediately think funeral. You hear that creepy rendition of the idée fixe, the fixed idea, played in the piccolo clarinet, going up into the squeaky high register, played with distracting wind flourishes and distracting percussion strokes, gives it a creepy sound. Well, he's going to amp up the creepy factor at the end. And what he does is, he writes in the program notes that this whole funeral imagery culminates in a kind of dance macabre where the skeletons are dancing on his grave in hell. I wish I had that picture of him up again. So what do you do if you want to create that sound that's supposed to evoke skeletons dancing on a grave? That's pretty specific, right? And remember, he's not going to write it in the program notes unless it's something we're intended to be able to hear. Otherwise, there's no point in writing it there. So what he does is very clever, and it's the first time that we have what at that point was called extended technique. And what he does is tells the violinists to play what's called an Italian technique. We call it now col legno. Well, those of you who speak a little bit of Italian know that legno means wood. So col legno, in German I guess it would be mit dem Holz. You turn the bow around, and you're not playing with the horsehair. You play with the opposite side. Now, I was talking to Amara before the program, and she said to me, does that sound good? And I said, no, not really. It's not supposed to sound good. It's going to sound clacky and it's going to have a scratchy sound. It's going to sound like a distortion of what the instrument should sound like. But remember, this is not a Mozart symphony. This is not a symphony where we're supposed to enjoy the sounds for what they are. We're supposed to be connecting what we hear with a story, a narrative that the composer's cooked up. And in Berlioz's case, it's a pretty wacky narrative. So if you asked me, how do you convey the imagery of skeletons dancing on a grave in hell, I would say you can't do it using the harmonic and instrumental techniques available to Enlightenment era musician. You need to invent something new. And that's what Berlioz does. So he creates the sound of the skeletons dancing by asking the string players to flip their bows around and sort of clack the wood on the strings. And I'll just play that very briefly so you can get a sense of what it sounds like. And we'll listen to the last couple of minutes of this very creative symphony. There's a Dies Irae played in the bassoons and contrabassoon. It's coming up shortly. Right here. You hear that? Yeah, that's a wild piece. It's a totally novel approach to writing symphonic music. And he would have been 27 when he wrote this. 27 when he wrote it. Now, whatever happened to Harriet? Apparently, she went back to the UK and had no idea who this guy was. And then word started to get around because this piece was written in 1830, a couple of years after they had met. And she came to know the name Berlioz because by 1832, he was a known figure in artistic circles throughout Europe, on the continent and clearly away from the continent as well. And so she found out that this guy who's famously written this celebrated new symphony, the Symphonie Fantastique, wrote it about her. And she went to meet him and was, I guess, seduced by his charm. And they got married, and it was a miserable marriage. Within 10 years, they were at each other's throats. And again, because it's the Romantic period, this is a period where composers document everything. And he wrote all about how much he couldn't stand her. And she wrote about how much she loathed him. And it really fits the Romantic mold, doesn't it? The Romantic period, there's no happy endings. Tristan and Isolde, not a really happy ending. And take any Verdi opera, any Puccini opera. Tosca throws herself off the ramparts of the Castel San Angelo. Mimi dies of TB. Go to Madame Butterfly commits harakiri. I mean, it's just one story after another. The Romantics did not like happy endings. And part of it is sort of, we talk about it tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of it is, I think, because they saw in death and in frustrated mortal love, they saw an opportunity to be very expressive. And that's certainly true of the operas. In fact, I'm already looking ahead to my next lecture series here at the New Canaan Library. And I think opera's got to be next because we talked about so much instrumental music. All right, I want to get into Brahms now. We have a woefully inadequate amount of time to talk about Brahms. So we'll have Brahms split the program next week with Mahler. But we have time to do a bit of an introduction and to talk about how Brahms is so different from most composers in this period. Brahms is born 1833. That's 6 years after Beethoven dies. So he grows up in a period where, like everybody else, as we've established and we've said a few times now, they all worship Beethoven and are all indebted to Beethoven in some way. Now, what does that mean for the composers of the 19th century? Well, as we've seen with Berlioz, to get around the shadow of Beethoven, you just do something that he hasn't really done, and thus you avoid comparison. So if you write a symphony that involves drugs and psychedelic hallucinations and a trip to hell, really a trip to hell, if you do that, you're not treading on Beethoven's toes, and nobody's going to compare it and say, well, yeah, it's great, but it's not Beethoven. Leonard Bernstein, by the way, had a great line about Berlioz. This was in the 70s, at the height of psychedelia. Bernstein said, Berlioz had it right in 1830. If you do drugs, you will have a bad trip and wake up in hell at your own funeral. So if Berlioz is swimming with the tide, and the tide again is towards this new progressive style of music, away from Dr. Burney's definition, away from music for music's sake, and towards programmatic music, a lot of composers who wrote symphonies fit that mold. Franz Liszt would be a good example. Liszt, of course, wrote the Faust Symphony, a symphony that's based on the story of Goethe's Faust, about a man who sells his soul to the devil, essentially Mephistopheles, the devil. Later on, at the end of the century, we have another French composer, Claude Debussy, who writes a symphonic poem of sorts, where he's, again, writing what is essentially symphonic music, but based on this story of a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, where it's the afternoon of the faun. And the music starts, and it's supposed to be, it's based on a poem where this faun, which is a sort of half goat, half human creature, is waking up in the forest, and you get this flute solo. Because in the poetry, first thing it says is that the faun wakes up and plays the pipes of Pan. Played in the flute here. And then a harp comes in. Dreamy, right? With horns sort of playing right on top of each other there. So Debussy, again, he's not writing symphonic music that's Symphony No. 1 in C major. You don't get that. And you don't get it very often in the Romantic period. For a couple of reasons. A, I think they saw in this kind of music an opportunity to be expressive. And B, because if you wrote a symphony in the style of Mozart or Haydn or Beethoven, you'd be compared to them. And that would mean that you haven't done anything new. You haven't done anything novel. You haven't contributed to the repertoire in a meaningful way. You've done what every student does in conservatory, which is you copy examples. You write something in the style of composer X. There's one composer who stands out in the 19th century as swimming against the tide, as really being what is often described as the bearer of the classical flame, the heir to Beethoven, the successor of the Enlightenment era and early Romantic symphony, and that would be Johannes Brahms. So even though he's born in 1833, Brahms is writing symphonic music in the 1870s and 1880s, which is closer to Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn than it is to Berlioz, for example. Because he's writing, remember what we talked about in the beginning of the program, we talked about absolute music. It's just music. You listen to it, they're notes, played by instruments with different sound colors. And those sounds are pleasing, or they're driving, or tumultuous, or whatever they are, but they're just sounds. There's no imagery associated with it. And it's a very bold thing to do in 1875, which is about the time of Brahms's first symphony premiere. He's 42 years old at the time. And we talked last week, we said a lot of composers never made it to their 40th birthday. Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schubert, Mozart, all dead before 40. So Brahms waits an awfully long time to write his first symphony. Actually, he had been working on it for 20 years. The fair copy shows that he starts this thing in the 1850s. But he waits till 1875-ish to have it premiered. He's 41 or 42 at the time. And his publisher is sort of heckling him, saying, Johannes, what's going on? Where's the symphony? Well, I don't know if that's exactly what he wrote, but he wrote letters urging Brahms to finish the symphony. And Brahms writes back, and it's a very famous quote, often repeated, often paraphrased, and I think it gets to the heart of what many composers must have felt. He writes to the publisher, he says, you don't have any idea what it's like to have that giant trampling behind you. And it's Beethoven, and it's this idea that if you write a symphony that's just a symphony, people are going to hear it and they're going to say, well, yeah, but how does it compare to the Fifth Symphony? And you're not going to go toe-to-toe with Beethoven. That's a bold move. And of course, Brahms does just that. When we reconvene next week, we're going to jump right into the listening, so we'll have more time to listen next week, I promise. We've laid some good foundation, and next week we'll be able to reap what we've sown in terms of our foundation by indulging in more listening. When we listen to Brahms' First Symphony and we get to the finale, we're going to hear a theme that's awfully familiar. And of course, it's familiar because it sounds, at least on the surface, a bit like Beethoven. And we'll look at that next week. Brahms was famously asked, well, doesn't that sound like Beethoven? And his response was, of course, you idiot. Yes, it sounds like Beethoven. He chooses to confront the issue of Beethoven's legacy by charging headfirst into the mouth of the dragon. He's not afraid of being compared. He's kind of inviting comparison. And Brahms was often considered a very traditional composer, somebody who sort of went back to the past rather than anticipated the future. But actually, as I'm going to try to point out next week, Brahms is a very progressive composer in many ways. Much of it has to do with rhythm. So that's going to be how we'll start our program next week. We will also have time next week to talk about really what I think for many people is the culmination of the symphonic period lasting about 150 years from 1750 to 1900. Of course, there have been symphonies written after, beautiful symphonies. I recently listened to a performance of Leonard Bernstein's Symphony No. 3. Some of you may know it, the Kaddish Symphony. Spellbinding piece, not easy to listen to and very dissonant at times. So there has been symphonic music written in the 20th century, and it's worthy of discussion. But I think in terms of what people would call classical symphonic music, if we're looking at a period of 150 years, we might start with Haydn, and as I've chosen to do with this series, we're going to end with Mahler. So we're going to listen to the finale of Mahler's Second Symphony. Now, the symphony itself is about 95 minutes long. So we're only going to have time to look at a thin slice of it. But I will give you a few suggestions as we head into next week. If you have time, go on over to YouTube and just type Mahler's Second Symphony and listen to it. There's a great performance with Gustavo Dudamel conducting with the BBC Proms at the Royal Albert Hall. You can't miss it. It'll be one of the first videos that comes up. Next week, or if you choose to when you listen to it at home, when you listen to the finale of Mahler's Second, obviously bring yourselves, but also Gesundheit, bring a box of Kleenex. Because when you get to the finale of Mahler's Second, it's just about the most emotionally manipulative music that I can think of in the symphonic repertoire. And I mean that in the best way possible. This is music that is designed to open the floodgates of your tear ducts. And it does so by, A, introducing a theme as a sort of overarching meta-theme of the symphony, which is very poignant and something that everybody can connect to and was very clearly close to Mahler. And it's the theme of death, afterlife, and resurrection. And we're going to talk about it more in depth in the context of Mahler's own life experiences and what it might have meant to him personally as he was writing this music. It is sublime. It is towering in its scope. He calls for every instrument under the sun, basically, and a church organ. So it's a huge, monumental piece, and we're going to end our series next week by talking about it. But I hope you've enjoyed some Halloween-themed music from 1830 with Hector Berlioz. And I want to thank everybody once again for coming out, and thank you to Amara and to the library for having me, for making these kind of events possible. And they're so enjoyable for me, and I'm just very grateful to have such a strong showing.